Before I begin, just a little bit of a trigger warning. This book is about the sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl. And if that is something that you don't want to hear me talk about, feel free to click away. In 2012, members of a celebrated high school football team assaulted an unconscious 16-year-old girl at a party after a winning scrimmage. As bad as that initial act is, the fallout was just as bad as it divided a community, as many members of the community vocally defended the rapists. This is not the type of book I normally read. This is not the type of book I normally review. So, as you see in the title of this video, why am I talking about this very difficult book? Why do I feel obligated to talk about it? This happened in my hometown. So at the outset, I want to be clear, I'm not monetizing this video. I'm not playing my intro or my outro. I'm not asking you to like or subscribe. I simply want to talk about this book and hope that some lessons can be learned from this book. Additionally, I don't want this to feel like I am somebody who left my hometown and now I want to just slam it and say what a backwards small town it is now that I've moved to the bigger city. That is not the case at all. I have nothing but fond memories growing up in Steubenville, Ohio, and I feel that it shaped who I am. Very blue-collar town where you really learned about hard work. You didn't have the resources that a lot of people in bigger towns have, so what you got was through your own merit and through your own hard work, and I have nothing but fond memories growing up there. Additionally, I have lifelong friends and family members that live in that community and some of the surrounding communities. So I do not have an axe to grind. This is not a situation where I saw my hometown in the news in a negative light and celebrated. In fact, it made me very sad. So this book was a difficult book to read, especially knowing a lot of some of the participants in this book, not the perpetrators or anything like that, but community members. And it was a difficult book to read, but I feel obligated to talk about it because I think there's a lot that needs to be said about this book. Small towns have it tough. Bigger cities have a lot of sources of civic pride that small towns lack. A bigger city, you have lots of philanthropic organizations, arts organizations, institutions of higher learning, pro football franchises, a lot of things that the city can just take pride in. Small towns, it's a lot tougher. There aren't nearly as many options. So in a lot of small towns, the civic pride is wrapped up in its schools, and for good reason. And even in Steubenville today, there's one of their elementary schools is one of the highest ranked in the state of Ohio. So it's great that small towns take pride in their schools. And an extension of that is their sports teams. When their teams are successful and their boys or their girls are winning against bigger cities or even neighboring communities, it's a source of pride. And in Steubenville, that's been a great source of pride for a very long time. As a city, Steubenville, Ohio kind of peaked in the 1940s, at least if you look at the census data. And since then, it's been a steady decline. And the steepest drop-off in the decline in the population was in the 1980s when manufacturing jobs went away. Steubenville had always been a community where the man worked in the steel mill and the woman was a housewife. And as a lot of those jobs disappeared, a lot of people moved away looking for more opportunities elsewhere. And it's been dwindling since then, but in the 1980s, that's when the city was really in decline, at least in economic and population decline, and they were looking for a source of pride. We all want to have a great source of civic pride in our communities. Well, in Steubenville in 1983, they hired a visionary coach for the football team. And in his first 2 years in the job, they went 20-1, won the first state title that school had seen, and since then, it's been a dynasty of sorts. The coach is still there, was just inducted into the Ohio State Hall of Fame, and I think is one of the top 5 most winning active coaches across the country right now. So this was a great source of pride for this city. when you see that their boys would go up against prep schools in Cincinnati and Cleveland and Columbus, and they would go up against these big city schools, and they would come away victorious. It was a great source of pride. It continues to be so, and should be. It is something to be celebrated when you do have a lot of success in your schools and aspects of your school. One of the problems lies, however, when your pride in a football program becomes the adulation, adoration, deification almost of some of the individuals within the program. So that when these boys, because they are high school boys, do something wrong and something as heinous as is depicted in this book, it's hard to see your heroes fall. And we could talk for days about how you shouldn't make a 16-year-old kid your hero. But when your greatest source of civic pride is this football team, it's hard for that not to happen. I read a book, or I attempted to read a book by Frederick Backman called Beartown. In Beartown, it's a small town in Scandinavia, I forget which country right now, where just like Steubenville, we have these small town great pride in their youth sports. In the case of this book, it's their youth hockey team. And halfway through the book, the chapter that I did not finish the book, there's a scene where the star hockey player is going to rape a high school girl. And that's when I stopped reading the book. Not only did I not want to read that scene, but I also knew what the rest of the book was going to be about, because that's what this book is about, is a lot of the fallout that happened. When national news media descended upon Steubenville, it wasn't because of the crime. It was because it was a community torn apart. There was such a cognitive dissonance from some very vocal people within the community that these football heroes couldn't have done what they have done. But even beyond that, this book speaks to rape culture. And I'm not going to speak to that very much because this is my first experience reading about it. The bulk of this opening of this video is talking about a small town and talking about its inhabitants and how much wrapped up they are in their youth sports, and for good reason. One last point to that effect, Steubenville's last census said the population is 18,000, and the football field, the stadium, Harding Stadium, fills 10,000 people every Friday night. So more than half the town every Friday night under those Friday night lights is cheering on the football team. This is a community that's very much wrapped up in this sport. So just like in Beartown, I knew what was going to happen, because that's what happened here, is grown people siding with boys who sexually assaulted a girl. And even the national news media screwed this up. You can't even say and just put the blame on a small portion of this city who was so vocal and supporting their boys that were not going to get to play football that year. The national news media even descended upon the city, and they talked about things like, well, it's a shame that these boys' lives were going to be ruined by this one act. But none of them ever discussed how this victim's life was ruined by this one act. And that inherent is the big argument about how there is a rape culture in this country, because so many people are able to have such empathy for the perpetrators, but not for the victims. The victim blaming in this case was appalling and heartbreaking and disgusting, and elicited so many emotions from me in reading this book. It reminded me of a scene from, I didn't read the book, but I did see the movie, A Time to Kill, where there was an assault of a young black girl by some racist white men, and the way that the lawyer got everybody to think about it in a different light as he described the crime in a lot of horrific detail. And then at the end he said, what if she were white? And I think of this here. You think about the horrific detail, how these boys carried this unconscious girl from a party into a car to transport her to another place where they would commit this crime. What if that was your daughter? That's what I want to say to the people that were trying to support these boys and didn't want to ruin these boys' lives because of this act. What if it was your daughter? The crime in this book is horrific. The fallout is horrific. But another aspect of this story that was so tough to digest was all of the bystanders at these parties. There were 3 different parties going on this night, and the victim was at all 3, unconscious at 2 of them. And not a single person stood up and said, "Stop, what you're doing is wrong," as these boys carried this unconscious girl from one party to the next. Additionally, the perpetrators and some of the people in the room took pictures and sent those pictures to others. And there's a famous video that's probably still on YouTube, I wouldn't want to watch it, where a student is joking about all of this, making rape a joke. If that doesn't reinforce the fact that there's a rape culture in this country, I don't know what does. Now, as for the book itself, the author's not an author. This is her first book. She's a filmmaker, and she made a documentary, which I think you can find on Netflix or Amazon Prime, of the same name, Roll Red Roll. The author's name, again, is Nancy Schwartzman, if I hadn't mentioned that at the outset. This is better written than a lot of books of this type that I've read. I think there's a narrative strength that flows from chapter to chapter that is often neglected. Now, it is written very journalistically, but that's kind of the style here. But I felt it had a narrative momentum that a lot of books of this kind lack. A lot of time when I read a true crime novel, what I often get is each chapter kind of feels like a magazine article, and it doesn't kind of have a narrative whole that's good. I also know that, because I haven't watched the documentary yet, I don't know if I will, I also know that this happened several years after the conclusion of the documentary, so there are several chapters and maybe a little bit more closure, or at least continues the story of some of the people in this. And unfortunately, it doesn't end with a lot of hope. And I found that disappointing. I had hoped for a little bit of hope myself. But hope is the reason that I'm talking about this book and leaving this review, is that I hope that someone who sees this review reads the book. And I hope they learn something about the rape culture and the other topics covered in this book. And I hope that they talk to others, so that my greatest hope with this review is that at some point in the near future, when a group of boys are carrying an unconscious girl to a car, that someone steps up and says, "Stop, what you're doing is wrong," and that a crime like this can maybe be prevented in the future. Thank you for watching.